Hi, guys. I am excited to be able to share a little bit about my paper with you today. I am passionate about the relationship between worship and mission and driven by the message in Isaiah 1 that links these two necessary components of a Christian life together. Isaiah 1 is often taught with the warning label, "This is how not to worship." This summation is superficial and can leave the students asking, what is the right heart attitude and how is that demonstrated? However, when Isaiah 1 is placed within the larger framework of the ancient Near East, learners are offered a more in-depth picture. My paper argues that Isaiah 1 links the worship of God and the mission of God together by proclaiming several truths about worship. Worship remembers. Worship requires loving God and loving others. Worship must present an alternative agenda, and worship compels justice. Worship remembers. Yahweh gave his physical people physical ways through which to engage with and remember him. However, the Israelites had moved away from the true understanding of Yahweh's gift of participating in tangible sacrifice and now participated in sacrifice as a way to appease their God rather than as a way to have a relationship with him and as a result continue in obedience to him. The sacraments of baptism and communion have been given to us today to remember and to participate with Christ together in his life and mission. Corporate worship, as the language of God's recreation, enables Christ followers to participate in worship, which compels them to be sent out. Worship requires loving God and others. In the ancient Near East, religion and life were bound together. There was a symbiotic relationship which made it necessary for people to maintain proper relationships with their gods by offering sacrifices so that their gods would be appeased and continue to provide for them. The difficulty they faced in this was that they did not know what their gods actually wanted. But the Israelites had a distinct advantage because they served a revealed God who had told them what he required. Israelite worship was to be about more than appeasing a god. It was to involve reaching out to care for others. This did not change when Christ came. In fact, Jesus further increased its emphasis by tying the commandment to love others to the commandment to love God. Loving others and loving God cannot be separated. Worship must present an alternative agenda. Isaiah 1 reflects the failure of the Israelites to properly follow Yahweh's worship structure, which had been creatively crafted to allow their worship to stand out in contrast to the worship of other cultures. Worship helps us to see the world as God intends it to be. While Israel was to attract people by her example, Christians today are to go and tell. So while worship must still proclaim and show God's story, creative dissection of culture must play a role in developing worship that is both relevant and biblical. Worship compels justice. In Isaiah 1, Yahweh called out his people for failing to live lives that demonstrated him to the world. He demanded that they change their ways or they would have consequences to pay. Isaiah 1 serves as a warning to Christians today. There is no dichotomy between the sacred and the secular. Christians are to offer themselves as living sacrifices in worship at all times and everywhere, which requires loving others through the eyes of God so that they may be served in the same manner. Worship that fails to enact God's justice fails to demonstrate God's love to the world. Thus, it actively participates in harming souls. God's people are called out. They are set apart. They are to come before God with hearts bent in right worship, which means obeying God by loving him and loving his people. Loving his people requires reaching across gaps to recognize needs, meet needs, and share the gospel story of Christ, the alternative narrative that interacts with and shapes stories, inviting those stories into true worship that will compel hearts to mission and back to celebration.